From Flourish DX, this is the Mentally Healthy Workplaces Asia podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a critical issue for businesses, this is the source of information for creating sustainable and mentally healthy workplaces in Asia.
Welcome to the Mentally Healthy Workplaces Asia podcast. My name is Enoch Li, and I'm the host of this podcast and the Chief Impact Officer at Flourish DX. The purpose of this podcast is to be a platform for thought leadership, conversation, and practical guidance from subject matter experts, service providers, innovative tech platforms, and employers. We as a community have a shared responsibility, not just as individuals, but as employers, colleagues, and the broader community to help create mentally healthy workplaces so that we can prevent suffering and promote human flourishing. Today, I'm really excited because it's the first time I've actually had a guest in my little podcast studio, inverted commas, because it's literally my study. Welcome to Enoch Li.
Thank you. Nice to be with all of you here.
It's kind of surreal because we usually do it by Zoom and the person's on the other side of Zoom. So I had to set up the studio. I had to get another chair in. It's actually really fun. And I wish one day I could have a professional podcast studio. Hint to my employers. Anyway, I'm just going to dive into a bit of Enoch's background because I think it's super fascinating. And then we'll go into our usual questions and have a chat. So Enoch is widely recognized for pioneering the workplace mental health conversation in China. A time when the topic was taboo, through founding an award-winning social enterprise, Therapy, that spearheaded strategic consulting and training services for organizations in China and Asia Pacific. Her social impact work has proven to raise awareness in the local community and steer global conversations on the topic. She has helped many through Therapy, her writing and speaking about her mental health and experience. Enoch works with multinationals, governments, and startups across Asia Pacific to change mindsets and behaviors towards mental health, deepening awareness and understanding to reduce stigma and create psychological safe workplaces. Her work is widely recognized in society. She was awarded the Social Contributor of the Year 2018 award by the International Professional Women's Society in China and the Speaking Out Award by Mind HK. Therapy was recognized by the Beijing government's OTEC Awards as the Community Hero in 2020 and top 3 of the UN China Social Impact Awards in 2021, based on the social impact contributed in the mental health space. Her latest book, which she's given me a copy and literally I snuck in 2 pages of reading just then, it's called Stress in the City, shares her personal journey, which we're going to dive into, and discusses some fun ways to cope with depression and suggests how adults and parents can be playful. It's kind of cool. We're definitely going to dive into that. So tell me, I've read all these things. read out these things about you, but tell me about your journey and what got you here.
Sure. Thank you. And it's lovely to be here, like you say, in person recording a podcast, because I think I've also gotten quite used to Zoom over the years. So I think if I look back on the journey, I started off, growing up in Hong Kong, pretty sort of, the good girl, not the top student, but, good enough grades and kind of A minus, A minus, B plus, depends on the subject, right? Exactly. It's like my mom would go, what happened to that, 2 marks?
That minus.
Exactly. But I think you point out something really prominent for, I think, a lot of us who grew up in Asia, where the mindset has been very geared towards achievements. And in a space where I think I grew up learning that, it's okay to be happy and smiling in front of people, but any sort of crying and tears, you can't show that, right? So I think I grew up with that mindset, and I now understand it, philosophically as well, and I get it. But what happened to me was, as I graduated from university, I started working in the banking sector. And I had this narrative in my head of, I'm invincible, I'm working hard, playing hard. Companies been sending me as an expatriate to different cities. So, sort of the high life. Yeah. And I kind of go, well, I eat, I go to yoga class, I work hard, I'm earning money, I look okay. So, life must be fine. And I think what I did was I ignored a lot of the signals that my body was giving me periodically throughout the years of frequent colds, frequent headaches, backaches. I would kind of relinquish it to say, well, the air conditioning was too cold in Tokyo, right? And I ignored the stomach aches I would get. And I think what the body was telling me was actually, it's not that I can't handle it, but maybe I'm not coping with the stresses around my life well enough. Like, I don't think I even had the awareness that these things were maybe stresses, that uprooting myself every 2-3 years was actually, you know, it takes a toll on the body, takes a toll on the mind. You've got to recreate your social circle each time. And I thought, you know, I'm 20 something, I'll be able to deal with it. You know, I'm okay. I'm all right.
You're type A. You can
exactly. You know, I'm type A plus, you know, the plus in. And then when I moved to Beijing with the company, it felt like a sudden collapse. But if I look at it now, it wasn't. It was building up. And it started off with migraines that got worse and worse. I almost fainted in the office. And for those who've never had a migraine before, it can be really debilitating to the extent that you have tunnel vision, you don't see your periphery, you get really nauseous. And I even remember criticizing myself of why do I have a migraine? Like, only weak girls get migraines. You know, I think influence from reading magazines and as a teenager. And so that slowly built up, started to get really physically debilitated. And then I went to see the doctor and I did every single specialty test that's possible to rule out anything. I was like, maybe I have a brain tumor. And those things, I think back then would be easier to grasp in my head of, well, I have an illness and I can deal with it. Because the doctor did say, why don't you go see a psychologist? You may be stressed. And I smirked at her and go, you've got to be kidding me, right? Like, what do you mean stressed? Like, you know, like, I'm 28. What are you talking about? But eventually I did see a psychologist. And that was because one day, and this was during my sick leave, that I told my boyfriend, who's now my husband, I said, well, I should see a shrink. And he asked why. And I said, well, I'm visualizing drowning myself in the bathtub. And that's really when it clicked in my head, okay, something's not right. And so from that journey where I started to learn about, there is something called clinical depression, what it is, what it feels like. And for 2-3 years, you know, it was just really difficult sometimes to get myself out of bed. I shut the whole world out for months. I deleted people from Facebook. I didn't get out of bed. I didn't eat. And to actually live through that. And I think the biggest realization was meeting myself in that space of, this isn't the person I recognize. Yeah, I look in the mirror and go, I can't even comb my hair. I can't, just all of those functionalities were gone. And what tipped me over was, I remember starting to write about depression on my blog, because my shrink realized that I liked writing. So it's like, oh, why don't you write about it? You know, writing therapy. And of course, as achievement focused perfectionist, I can't just write, you know, I have to start a blog.
Now write a book.
Exactly. But it's like, you know, you've got to be an overachiever in depression. It's always a bit amusing for me. But somebody wrote to me through my blog, and I didn't know that was possible back then. So it really surprised me. And it turns out to be somebody I knew from university. And she said, Enoch, I don't know if you remember that time, but, you know, there was a period of time when I didn't come to class or I didn't hand in my homework. And just like, I know exactly what you're going through. And that really broke me down, because that was a moment I realized the biases I had, not just to the condition of mental health, but also towards other people. Because I remember thinking, I was like, why is she so lazy? You know, like, what's wrong with her? Why doesn't she just, you know, pull it together? And then to go through it myself and have people tell me that, I suddenly, you know, on both sides of the fence, I suddenly realized, wow, there's a completely different interpretation to the story. And there's an experience that I had never once imagined. And that was really humbling and painful for me to realize that I wasn't very nice to people, maybe in the workplace, in the past. And that's really, I think, part of the big trigger for growing and building therapy, where I started to think, one, if there are people like myself in this demographic growing up this way who may be experiencing depression and find it really difficult to talk about and suffering in silence, well, that needs to change. And secondly, I also had the ambition of, well, can we then change the biases and perceptions of how we view it, and particularly in the corporate space, where we will be touching, and, you know, there's just lots and lots of people. I'm like, we've got to change that. We've got to change the root of the issue, where, you know, life and work shouldn't be like that. You know, we've got to change the culture systematically. And so that was the impetus of therapy and sort of how I got to where I am today.
Well, thank you for sharing. I mean, it's really brave, and thank you for being really open with that. And and I just hope that people listening in, I mean, I think all of us will know someone. Like you know, you recollect that someone actually went through a tough patch, you didn't hear from them. Or actually even sometimes you feeling like that yourself. So I think what you've done, like just sharing your experiences, is really, number one, really helpful. But then I guess the next part is like starting therapy and trying to, can you tell us, why therapy first?
Okay, yes. So the name comes from my own experience of playing my way out of depression. And it was really by chance that during my really depressed period, I chanced across this bear. It's a soft toy bear. And it's not your typical teddy bear. It's more like, it looks like a polar bear type thing. And it kind of sits there and look at you. And I smiled at the bear, seeing it, by chance. And Tim, my boyfriend, he said, wow, I haven't seen her smile for months. I'm going to get the bear for her. And when we got home, he said, can you name the bear? Like, give it a name. I said, oh, he can be called Floppy. And he asked why. I know, right? And he asked why. I'm like, well, he just kind of sits around all day, don't do much and no energy. And back then I didn't understand what I was doing. But as I got better and transitioned, I went to study an executive master's in organizational psychology. And that's when I started to dig into my own experience as well, and started to learn that, my collection of soft toy bears that started to build up with their names, with their personalities, that is in essence a projection of myself onto bears. So if you look at my bears, they're all a bit my different aspects of my personality. And particularly why that was helpful was there were some bits of myself that I don't quite like or can't quite accept for a long time. But if you put it onto a cute teddy bear, then it's not as threatening, right?
Not like a cute
exactly.
Bear, really.
And that's kind of what helped me process my experience, deal with, or maybe I was a bad person, not bad as in bad, but maybe my over calculating, too ambitious, not really prioritizing my friends and social well-being. And it really became a safe space for myself, and it's a bit fun. And I started researching on playfulness for adults, and all the good things it does for us in stimulating creativity, but also in self-awareness. And so bear therapy. But I also want to make it clear, we don't deliver therapy per se. That's not the licensing that we have, but it's sort of the name stuck. It used to be a blog of, photo blog of my bears that I create stories with them. And it slowly developed the identity into the consulting service and the training service we provide. And I think it's, we've had questions around the name of, well, we don't understand the name. I was like, well, but that's a conversation starter. And it's very also smart. Like our identity as well, that I didn't want to just remove just because, we need to be a bit more quote unquote corporate. Yeah.
I think the play part is really interesting. A lot of organizations here, and I know some facilitators do Lego serious work. And I loved Lego growing up. Like, I mean, the number of times I've stepped on Lego and it's like killed me.
I know. I step on my son's now and I was like, I want to crack you.
It's painful thing ever. But and just doing, and it really sparks creativity and just that playfulness. And it's like, you can do it in a corporate setting. So I like that you're breaking the rules around that. But like, if you're going to explain, okay, what does therapy actually do in the corporate setting?
Sure. So the easiest way to understand, I think there's two key deliverables that we work with companies. And when I say companies, at the moment, most of our clients are multinational companies and some larger Chinese companies in China who are really thinking about, well, what does employee well-being mean? And we look at it from an educational perspective, where how can we help individual executives increase their awareness towards mental health? But it's not just awareness, it's also building knowledge and building a variety of knowledge so that they can start to personalize their own skills and habit change that will look after their own mental well-being. Right? So we want to give them a buffet of choice, different kinds of psychological approaches, and to build their skills around, this is important. And then another way we address it that has become much more, let's say, mainstream over the years. And trust me, there's been years of rejection.
Yeah. That's one of my questions.
Yeah. Where we're also speaking at a much more strategic and senior level with the C-suite, with board of directors, with chief HR officers to go, a workshop to increase awareness is great. Storytelling, it's great. Lived experience, great. Fireside chat's great. But it can't be just that 2 hours in 365 days. So how can we strategically review for the next 2 to 3 years? Like, build a business plan like you would for any other product in the company, and say, this is the plan, this is the budget, this is where we want to get to. This is how it aligns with the company values and business. So from the mental health agenda, how does it tie in with HR policies? How can it tie in with other issues like perhaps bullying, harassment? How can it tie in with talent retention, leadership development? And really looking at it from a comprehensive perspective of culture, company culture, and also just business, the bottom line, because most of them are for-profit companies, and we can't deny that. But also taking the conversation to the board of directors on, corporate governance, reporting, the buzzwords these days, ESG, the S, people, and hoping that we don't lose sight at the end of the day. It is about people, it is about humans, and it's not just another data set of assessments and metrics and tools. So that's what we do with companies at the moment.
That's really great. With the S, I mean, you've done an article, I think it's the eco business on the silent S in ESG. And I'll just be really honest, you have to pay for that article, so I couldn't read it.
I'll send you a copy afterwards.
I was like, I'm just going to ask her. So anyway, can you just talk about what that article is about? Because definitely we're seeing so much movement and so much stuff happening in the ESG space, but it's really, a lot of it's always on the E side. And the S is very silent. So can you just dive into that interview that you did?
Sure. I was so that was it was a personal interview piece where we did talk a bit more about the career, but really projecting into the future. What does the S mean concretely? Because like you say, I think the E, and I don't know much about the E, I admit, but it seems more tangible in terms of how we measure the emissions, what are the calculations. And it has also been talked about for, decades. So it's a bit more sophisticated in the evolution. And the G, in terms of governance, that relates a lot to regulations, laws. So that's also comparatively tangible. The S, actually, as we started delving into it, and this was my own bias in the beginning of, it's going to be difficult because it's also a bit intangible. We don't know how to measure. And when we're talking about ESGs, we're really talking about governance and reporting at the board level. So we're talking about, listing rules and all of that. So at some point, there needs to be a number on it for comparisons, for benchmarking, whatnot. But as I delved into it, I also discovered that it's maybe not as intangible or as difficult as we think it is, because S can encompass a lot around how you, I think, on one end, prevent crisis from happening, and also how do you manage it when crises happen. And the physical side of occupational health and safety, we can imagine, like if you're on a construction site and something happens, and that actually in some ways is quite developed in the conversation. I think what needs to evolve is, how do we start putting mental health as part of that discussion? It doesn't need to be the whole of it, but it needs to be tied into the other things that we just mentioned. How do we address harassment in the workplace? How do we deal with the diversity policies? It's not just about gender. It's also about the diversity of thought. It's about the diversity of mental health lived experience, for example. How can a workplace be conducive to somebody who has, for example, bipolar mood disorder, to be able to engage with them when they are in a manic swing and when they're in a depressive swing, versus somebody, it's the same thing as, somebody who comes in to the office sitting in a wheelchair, where it's easier to see and we can change the work environment. But like mentally, how do we change that? And also, how do we connect that to things like the people development side? So it's not, I would hope that it's not just the laws and ticking the boxes of, we tick all the boxes of ISO and, we meeting the labor requirements, but really a more proactive way of thinking. How do we create a well workplace for people so that these issues and crises don't happen in the beginning?
I think the preventative part is, it needs to be, it's key. Because the number of people who are getting psychological injury from work, which you've been through, And burnout, you know, that's kind of the buzzword. And then like quiet quitting is another word.
Oh, yes, that's it. Yeah. Tamping, right? Yeah, in Chinese. Yeah.
Oh, what happens in Chinese?
Tamping, so lie flat. I actually just saw a little clip from the World Economic Forum of quiet quitting, how it may trace its origins to the Chinese term tamping, which is lie flat, where the younger generation of workers in China go, well, you know, if I work so hard, I'm not really earning much money and I'm working 24/7. It's a toxic workplace. I don't know if you're familiar with the term 996, so 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, particularly in the tech sector. So they came up with the term of tamping. I was like, I might as well just, you know, lie down at my home. Yeah.
So interesting. Well, to be honest, I had to Google like this. I mean, not Google, but just read up what it was. But yeah, I mean, in the age of people just like kind of giving up, and it's like helplessness. I think that's the kind of thing, is like helplessness, and then you just have no motivation to actually want to do anything.
Like why overinvest?
But I guess that's where the preventative and just all the things that you said totally resonate with that. I think we would hope that people do it for the right reasons, and you want to be a leading employer. But I think the good part about regulations and psychological health and safety coming into some countries like Australia, it's that you're held to accountability. Sometimes I think as human beings, self-regulation does not work. I'm actually thinking about, you know, my like so-called diet all the time. That I'm just like, oh, I need to eat healthy, and then potato chips. It doesn't work.
It is still vegetable, you know.
We agree.
Right.
But yeah, like I think that's where I think regulation is important, and you need to tick that box for those people who don't actually want to do it, and it's good, you have no choice. You know? I know we could talk about this a lot, but I want to talk about the rejections and just in terms of like trying to do this work in China. I mean, we in this podcast, I just kind of really love to unpack, like, you know, where mental health in the workplace is in the general region. But definitely like in places like China, I could imagine it would be really, really difficult, like, and really hard, and just a lot of people just say no. I don't know what you're talking about.
I mean, there's been mixed experience, and when I first started, say 7-8 years ago, I'm noticing how the years add up. Like those years when I first started, I do remember trying to approach companies, and I even offered, you know, I won't even charge you. Just let me come and share the story. Let me just come and talk about mental health. And it was no, thank you. Or I got a reply which actually helped me solidify my conviction and draw the line of what I wanted to do and what I believe therapy stood for. One of the companies came back and said, we don't want to use the word mental health. We don't want to use the term depression. We don't want to really talk about it. But can you anchor and come and do a talk for us? You know, it would have been a keynote, and it would have actually been a really good paying gig. And I said, can you come and talk to us about how to be happy? And I really struggled for 3 days, because I'm like, well, I'm starting out. It'd be really good to get them on the CV. It was a well-paying gig as well, but it just didn't feel right, because I'm like, my message isn't how to be happy. And I'm sure there are going to be a lot of great speakers out there who can speak very inspirationally about that, but that's not what I would like to do. And that's where I had to draw the line, but it also clarified for me what therapy was going to do. And I said no to them. I said, that's just not the message. So I'm not going to do this, because I think our message has been, it's not about being happy or unhappy. It's about understanding that mental health is part of life and how we receive it and embrace it in our different ways, right? So the rejections came in those forms, and one rejection I think it's my favorite rejection, because when I was doing my executive masters in a business school, I tabled the idea of, you know, mental health at work and play and all of it. It was, you know, the experimental stage. And one of my classmates, who's also Asian, and he actually was the chief HR officer of a pretty big hospitality group in APAC, he told me pretty straight up, it's like, you know, that's just not going to work. We won't pay for these kind of things. He's like, don't even try. And so he can kind of imagine the sort of disappointment I had, right? Like, I was like, okay. And the funny thing was, after we graduated, he was the first one who called me up and said, you know, can you come do something for our HR team? And he was also very blunt with it. He's like, look, we just don't have the budget, but if you want to try it out, I'm willing to offer that. And for me, that was a really good opportunity to test out the idea. And that was how those rejections, I think, it's a bit cliche, but those rejections really helped me crystallize what is it that we do and provide as a company, and the mission and the vision that we want to stand for, and what are the things that we will not do not do, or maybe it's just not our space to do well. Because I think the difference for a social impact company is there is a cause, there is a message. So it's not just about, well, the client wants this, so we offer and we give it to them. So the rejections has been, and I'm quite happy to say the number of rejections has gone down, and it's actually now tipped to where we have a lot of inward inquiries, referrals, word of mouth, people who've used our services, they tell their friends. And as I was rebuilding the team in the last 2 years, I think we've just been busy responding to these inward inquiries, and hopefully in the future we can also be more proactive again to be out there looking for these opportunities. And
I was going to say it's probably COVID, right? Like the pandemic, the 2 years where everyone's like, I'm not feeling well, and companies could see it, employers, and now they know they need to do something. So I could imagine you guys are very busy now, which is a great thing.
It's a great thing.
Okay, not the pandemic, but the fact that people are recognizing the need for help with mental health, just like physical health. I think people, that whole separation of, your health being mental and physical, but it's all joined.
It's all joined for sure. And
I think I've spoken about it on another episode. Like, it's just literally, it will manifest in your physical, your stomach.
That's what happened to me. But there's one thing I just mentioned that I'm not sure in a lot of the other geographies, and I suspect it's a bit like that too for some companies, but sometimes we get these requests, especially during the Shanghai lockdown, from companies and say, can you do something for our staff? Can you do like a resilience workshop? And we've had to very painstakingly tell them, we would love to help, but this is now not the time to do a resilience workshop. Your staff is traumatized. They're really going through emotional distress. They need to see a therapist. We can maybe connect you to therapists. They can maybe do, I don't know, group therapy, whatnot. But we're very clear as well that we don't offer therapy. That's not our license. We're much more on the education and prevention side. So now that they're in actually an emotionally distressed place, for us to come and talk to you about resilience seems a little bit besides the point, because they need a different kind of support. And those are the times which are really heart aching for me, because I'm like, I wish I can help. And there's part of me going, I wish you listened to me 2 years ago. But it's not too late. Please, try what you can. And when things settle a little bit more, people are back into a state of mind where they can learn, they can be educated, they feel a little bit more physically safe as well. Then we can revisit sort of the resilience training, the thinking about mental health and the culture, because I think the timing also makes a difference. And some of them really, I'm just kind of like, I wish you had done this earlier.
And I think you bring up a good point just about the collaboration, because I mean, I think it's really important to know where you can be of service. And then if you can't, who is out there? Right. And I think it takes everyone to work together. I think only before we started recording, it was just like, EAP. Okay, yes, that's really necessary, but that's not the only thing. And so there's a plethora of like approaches. Where having just one doesn't mean it ticks all the boxes.
Exactly.
Or covers it.
For sure.
So I think it's really like, I like what you just said, because all the time, especially I guess in the social kind of sector, or, when you really care about people, you really, really want to help. And saying no is really hard.
Very difficult.
Because people are suffering and you're like, how can I do it? But I think that's really amazing. But the referrals, I'm sure, was really helpful for them at that time.
I hope so. I mean, I have seen China do much better in terms of the community support, just community clinics, the hotlines, or the availability of hotlines have increased. Whether people actually answer the call, I'm not sure, because I've also tested it, but I've seen the statistics where, calls have been through the roof. But at least what's heartwarming for me is, well, at least people are calling, right? They are reaching out. And for better or for worse, this is part of the learning and education.
Wow, fascinating. So in terms of, now you're at a point of like, people wanting to engage, which is, and corporates wanting to engage is great. But do you have any tips on like, when you're trying to get like a potential client across the line, or even employees coming in and saying, okay, we really like HR, we really want this, but we can't convince upper management.
Yeah.
What kind of tips can you give, whether it's a carrot or stick approach? I know I hate to say that, but any tips, because I think sometimes I feel like listeners or people in this space, that we're all probably coming up against the same hurdles.
Yeah.
So any advice at all?
So I would say it also partly depends on the service provider. So, if I say Therapy was a service provider, how would we approach this conversation? I think it's also up to the service provider to really think about what is the product that they're offering. And ever since the beginning, I have been quite clear that I don't want to offer cookie cutter products, because yes, we can maybe very easily develop a curriculum, mental health 101, and replicate it and scale it. And, I might be the next unicorn, but that's really besides the point of what we try to do, because I think every company, even though they share some similar characteristics, every company will have a different identity, different character, different demographic of employees. And for our team, when we approach and work with clients, we do spend quite a lot of time upfront understanding who the company is and where they want to go, not just mental health, but just company values, company culture wise, and really having building that trust and rapport with the person that we work with in the company, usually HR or senior business leader, and understanding what is their pain point and what is their personal motivation for it. Because I think the more we can align with that, then we can also be thinking of ways of, I understand you need the extra budget. How can we help you create the business case so that you can go and then talk to your CFO or your boss? And it's until we have that trust, then they will tell us a little bit what are their internal organizational struggles, right? And so we spend quite a bit of investment of time doing that and understanding, because I think that really paves way for longer term relationships and partnerships. And I've seen clients now come back to us after, and it's fair, they don't really know who we are. So they say, like, we start with one workshop. And I think the best compliment is they come back and say, well, we now want 3. Well, now we actually want a consulting project. And I think that's because we've invested in trying to understand them at the beginning. But like, just very practically as well, there are times where everyone's on board except for the board of directors, for example, or for the C-suite. And what we do is myself, a lot of times we go in, we attend that board meeting or that senior leader meeting. We get 20 minutes where I just speak in their language they understand. So not in English or Chinese, but like the numbers language, the jargon that they are thinking about, and also what it means to them in their role as a board director or as the CFO or as a CEO. Why does it matter for your role and your management responsibility and leadership to be thinking about this? So then we talk about it in a way that's maybe in some way slightly detached from, individual well-being and all of it. But then because they do have to make a business decision. And I think what they need is somebody who understands their dilemmas, their business decisions, their limited resources. Because if I give you $1 here, then it's $1 less for another department. Then it needs to make sense. And we need to also convince them, well, what is the impact and the return on this, right?
I was going to say ROI.
Yes. And I think the most sort of persuasive talk that I've done to sort of this crowd is where I remember starting off actually with my personal story where maybe it was a bit of a shock factor. I go, I almost, I didn't want to live because of this. But then very quickly, I gave them the statistics of this is the macro environment. This is the business environment. This is the trend of what responsible businesses are going through. Do you want to be that, or would you like to stay behind here? Right? So that's a mix of the carrot and the stick. Do you
want to be an A+ organization?
Are you happy being B-? Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it's good. You're not gonna make my head. Well, no, I think that's really, really helpful. And it's really, each organization is unique. And what their pain points are going to be different. And I think spending that time up front is invaluable. So actually, I'm going to wrap it up because I know we could really talk forever, and you've got places to go to after this. So what is your hope for the future of workplaces and workplace mental health? I know it's a big question.
I would hope that there is the space where we're not just thinking about mental health in silo, but thinking about mental health across the board of how do we incorporate those topics in the leadership development training programs that a lot of companies do and spend millions on every year. So when we do a module on communication skills and active listening, for example, can that scenario incorporate something around mental health? Can we incorporate the idea of empathy into that? And how can mental health, and not just mental health, but all the other issues that we see in the social impact space, diversity, gender, sexual orientation, all of it, how can they all work together to be incorporated in these backbone and structure of the policies, right? Because I think the big question, and maybe just also the big answer why I've insisted on therapy, because at the end of the day, I think mental health is really just a tip of the iceberg. I think where I connect to it the most is very simply, but also very difficult. It seems like in this day and age, it's like, how can we be kind to each other?
Yeah.
Can we be good people to each other? And why are we spending time hurting each other? And I think that's, if we can get to that space, that would be my ideal. That would be my sort of dream. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Well, thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
And I hope this has been really helpful to our listeners. We always encourage, reach out to Enoch if you want to chat.
Yeah.
She'll be, all the details will be on the our LinkedIn and at the bottom of the notes of the podcast. So I just want to wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Back to China. And
Thank you.
Actually, we're in Singapore recording, so just for
yes.
Enoch's visiting at the moment.
Yeah.
So all the best going back there.
Thank you.
All the work that you're doing, and definitely stay in touch.
Will do.
Well, thank you to all our listeners, and don't forget to subscribe to the Mentally Healthy Workplaces Asia podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, and you can follow our LinkedIn page too to stay up to date with upcoming guests. You can also follow Flourish DX on LinkedIn if you like to see short clips of this conversation, and you'll be able to find the video version on Flourish DX YouTube page. And this is where you can see both of us in the room together. It's kind of cool. And like I said, please continue to connect with myself on LinkedIn and Enoch if you'd like to continue the conversation. Stay safe and see you at the next episode.
Thank you. Bye.
You've been listening to the Mentally Healthy Workplaces Asia podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in Asia, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.